Hello, you're welcome back to our React tutorial. So in this particular lesson, we are going to be looking into the React props. So the React props, they are just properties. The word prop represents property, and React properties helps us to pass data to our components. So you know that in the previous tutorial, we handled, we created components, and you saw the difference between the parent component and the child component. So for example, in the main.js, where we render all other components, this is a parent component, and if you also want to render it within the apps, then the apps is a parent component, and any other component that inherits from another component is a child component. Okay, so coming back to props. Props are just short form of properties. We can create props by passing the word prop. So let's do it in practice. So we can go to the components, and let's create a file and call it test prop.jsx. So if you notice, I have been using capital letter to begin my files. So each file I am creating, I am using capital letters to begin it. So let's create a function and call it test. Let's use this type of function, test prop. And you know our React is going to return something, whatever it is going to return. So here we pass in the word props. So here we pass in the props keyword. Now this is the short form of property, like I said before, and of course we have to return something here. So let's return a paragraph and say hello someone. So we really need to return maybe a variable. Let's have name. So let's use the curly brackets, and we can just call name, or let's call last name. Now we can't actually use this like this. We need to export this particular function. So we can say export default, and the name of our file is test prop. So now we can use this function outside the outside of this file. Now some people will be asking, why am I not importing React? So this is because in React 19 it is not mandatory that you import React, but if you like, it will still work if you do it that way. Okay, so I'm done with this. Then I will need to render it into the parent component, which in this case is the main.jsx. And I am going to do that here. I'm going to just call the app, which is test prop. Test prop, sorry. And also make sure you import test prop. Now that we imported text prop, you can see we are getting some error, and that's because it is waiting for us to pass in a variable into it. So if I say that last name is now Richard, now this is the parent component where we pass in the prop or the prop's value, but then it is still returning an error, and that's because here we are not supposed to return just last name like this. We're supposed to use props dot last name, and you can see it tells us that we have hello Richard. And if I should do this again, let's return the component again, which is test prop again, and like this, and I say that the property here is still last name because that's the prop's name, and we say is now Anthony. Now you can see it says hello Anthony. This is because we have set up this particular function to handle the logic. So this function here handles the logic, and then in the parent component where we render everything is where it inherits that that value of that property. And that is just how to handle props in React. Now let's go on to the next edition of this training, which is going to be on hooks. So the first hook we are going to be talking about is the use state hook. So I'm going to use this function as well. Let's use this function, and we are going to remove the prop, and here. So to be able to use the state hook, use state hook. Now I will need to explain what use state hook is. So what we basically do with use state is we take the changes that happen in our variables, and then we can effect them into our display. That is basically how I am going to explain the use state. So a state is the variable that you have, and then if you want to make changes in that variable, that is when you use a use state hook. Now to use the use state hook, we need to import use state. So we need to import the use state from React. Let's do that. Import use state from React. And that's how we import the use state. I'm just going to return something, which is the normal thing we do on React. Let's use the React fragment. And then here, we can set the state here. We can set the state here like this. So basically, this is just, let's do this. Let's use const, or we can use let, and then you pass in an array, and that array So let's make a counter that when you click on a button, it increments. So let's make a counter. So here we have to set our variable, which is the state, as count, and then we use set count. Now this is the convention, and then we set it as set count. We set it as use state, like this. Now here is where we pass in the initial value of the count. So let's pass in 0 here. So this is just the convention, an array, and then the variable, and then set whatever name you used. So if I used counter, then what I should have here is set counter. So this is the convention. So that's just it. Then here, okay, I see a mistake. So let's take this outside from the return block. Let's put it here. So we have the counter, and then we have set counter. If we have count, then it is set count. So whatever name you have here, it is going to be set whatever name that you have here. And then use state, then you pass in the initial state of your variable. So which means that count is 0 initially. So if I should return something like the count is, and we pass in count in this case. So you have to separate this with comma. So you see that it returns 0. If I make the initial value of the count 1, you can see it is returning 1. So this is the initial value of the variable here. This is the use state is a function that holds the count. That's the variable here. So like we said before, that the use state, that a state is your variable. So the state is this variable, and then the function here is the set function. So this set function takes the value of this count here. So this is the initial value of the count. So let's make it 0. Now let's have a button, and let's call the button press to count. Now since I'm using Bootstrap, I am going to use class name just to style it a little bit. btn dash danger, to have a red button. Now this button is not functional. We need to make it functional. And to make it functional, we have to use the onClick event. So I'm going to use onClick. So this is the way we use it. Unlike that of HTML, we use onClick like this. So unlike the HTML version where you have something like this, on click like this, equal to, then you pass your function. If it is count like this, you pass it this way. in HTML. But in React, we don't do it that way. We use this, and there's a function, and it's going to return an event. So now it's going to return an event. So let's have this function, and this is an arrow function. And this arrow function is going to return set count, and so it's going to return the set count function and then take in the count plus 1, because we want to increment the count by 1. So let's see if this works. So this is how we can set up the use states and event listeners. So to call an event in JavaScript is very simple. If you like, we can repeat it again. Let's repeat it. So let's have the button. Instead, I'm going to do .btn, and let's say counter, and this is going to be btn dash dark for a dark button. If you click it, it doesn't work, so it needs an event listener. So I'm going to use on click, and on click I'm going to pass in an arrow function, and this arrow function is going to take the set count, and the set count is going to have count plus 1. Let's see. You can see it is still working. So this is the use state.